Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Bean Studios. I am live here with a special guest from Montpelier. His name is Lincoln Earle-Centers, and we're here today to discuss the organization Braver Angels and the work that they're doing to bridge the political divide in Vermont and ultimately the country. So thank you very much for coming on today, Lincoln.
You're welcome, Paul. Nice to be with you.
I appreciate it very much. I know it's not too far of a drive, but any chance we get to have somebody to come on, we want to make it happen. Especially, you had reached out to Guy, and I've seen the email chain a little bit, and of course was involved in it. And a pretty cool organization you're involved in. Maybe just as a start, would you mind letting the people know what exactly Braver Angels is? And this is their logo for anybody wondering.
Absolutely. Yeah, so Braver Angels, in a nutshell, is a national grassroots organization. And it started after the first Trump election, when there was all the heightened rhetoric and strong feelings around that Clinton-Hillary elections of the 2016 cycle.
I didn't know that it started after that.
Yeah, so there was just a group of three guys that got together and had a workshop in Ohio, outside of Cincinnati, and they got 8 Hillary supporters and 8 Trump supporters together for a weekend and said, what would it be like to rehumanize each other here and to get beyond the stereotypes and the assumptions that we have about each other and articulate our differences, find where we have common ground, find where we really have differences, and see how we can engage those differences. Sure. And it was a real successful weekend, and people were sort of heartened and blown away by how different they encountered one another than the way that media portrayed one another to each other. And so that was the start of the project, and they took it on the road and had a bus tour that's 2017, early 2017, after the election. And one of the first places they went was Vermont, St. Albans, Vermont. We had a person up in St. Albans, Shauna Ratner, who invited them up there, and they did a workshop. It's called a Red-Blue workshop, and so in St. Albans, we have one of the oldest alliances. We call our local groups throughout the country. We've got alliances in all 50 states and activity in all 50 states. And Vermont was one of the first alliances. So up in Franklin County, there's an alliance that has been meeting for 7, almost 8 years now.
Wow.
And I think right now they meet quarterly, and it's the structural principle of the organization is that at every level, from grassroots up to leadership, there are a mix of red and blue representation. Okay. And Braver Angels uses red and blue language rather than conservative and liberal. Sometimes that language is tricky because people can feel apolitical or nonpartisan, or it's like, this doesn't describe me, or this is perpetuating the binary of, there's a lot. It's complicated, but in general, red-blue describes how you lean in the culture or how you lean politically. And so that's the language that Braver Angels uses. And so to make sure that at every level of leadership, there's a red and a blue representative to hold space together, and then trying to get activities to be mixed groups of people, just so you have engagement across social and political differences.
So I think it's a really interesting concept, and that's why we obviously wanted to have you on, because we're dealing with this obviously here in Vermont. We're dealing with this all around the country right now, and I think it's so interesting to think that what they're discovering is that, wow, we've been dehumanizing the so-called opposition. However, we're not really in opposition. And I guess what I'm wondering is when you go to these things and these people are talking with each other, do they ever question like the power structure that exists in this country? And are they saying like, wow, maybe we're being pushed to be divided, and why are we being pushed to be divided? Is that what comes up? I'm sure it does, I guess.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people, there's a self-filtering that happens, that people that are interested in this kind of work and seek it out and try to find something like this are already on that wavelength of what's going on. Why is division so rewarded and incentivized and amplified in our media, in our politics, in our electronic spaces that we spend so much time in now? And for people who don't think in those terms, it absolutely confronts that reality very quickly, to realize how against the stream it is to be countercultural in that way and swim against this tendency that we have to other each other and scapegoat each other and act not in good faith when we come across differences and disagreements. And so this is, work to try to hold space for people to have an experience and practice skills of not falling into those tendencies together.
It's really incredible. So, I mean, seriously, we need more of this in the country.
Right.
And I guess, I know you have an event that's coming up. Was it June 22nd?
June 22nd. Yeah.
Okay. And if we want to come back to that, maybe we definitely should.
That's great.
However, I just want to keep going on that thought where we're at. What are some of these experiences that people are having? Like, what have you experienced going to the Bravery Angels meetings and saying like, wow, this is like really something? Like, what's happening, I guess?
Absolutely. Good question. So I got involved in Bravery Angels about 3 years ago, sort of early in the pandemic. And at that time, most Bravery Angels activity was going on online through Zoom. And so we had a really strong local New England-wide alliance that was a group that met. And every month they would pick a topic and either do a workshop or have a conversation about something salient or something controversial and try to get different voices together to engage with each other. And I was at a point where that was just very attractive to me, and I was really curious about what brought. They had a podcast that has been through a few iterations at this point, but at that time I think I first encountered the organization through a podcast, and that was right after January 6th, if I remember right. One of the early podcasts that I listened to was a nuanced conversation with people who had been on the ground at January 6th, and I just found that to be so refreshing and so counter to the experience of so many people just getting on whatever high horse they were on either side and yelling at each other. And
what was that like? What were those conversations like?
That one, I just remember the impression of feeling really interested. It was like, oh, thank goodness there's some people holding space for the complexity and nuance of an event like this when everybody was just being in reactivity mode, whatever their relationship to that was.
Was that a podcast? You're saying
that was an early Bravery Angels podcast.
Okay.
And so then I was like, this is cool. I want to figure out how to engage more with this group and sought them out. And so I worked joined their leadership team in that regional alliance. And then as grassroots organizations go, where you have volunteer leadership, most of the organization is volunteer led. There's some national paid staff, but as organizations like that go, you get asked to do leadership when you step forward and show interest. And so I think at the time there was a fellow that was holding 3 or 4 states as the state coordinator, and so I stepped into the Vermont state coordinator role. And my main goal with my role has been to really be interested in trying to bring this in person and into local communities and just build networks for people to. There's still a lot of activity to engage with. braveryangels.org is the website, and there's an events calendar, and there's all sorts of workshops and debates and skills trainings that you can go and do online. And my goal is to just do more and more of bringing that in person for people to have access to those kinds of experiences.
Absolutely. So what I'm wondering too, so you've been to a handful of these meetings. You've probably helped put them on.
Yeah, facilitate
these meetings. And I guess like, what are some of the interesting back and forths? Like if you're saying that people are coming together, they're finding common ground.
Right.
Where are they finding common ground? And so you're talking about like controversial subjects, for example, January 6th.
Right.
What is that goal like? I mean, that's got to be really interesting. And I want to just say quickly, like, my thought is where they're already finding common ground is the fact that they're there, right? I mean, that shows that they're
willing to show up.
Yeah.
That's already so countercultural because there's this conflation so much, especially in progressive spaces, unfortunately.
Yes. There's
this conflation that if you show up and give somebody the time of day and show somebody dignity or understanding, that you're agreeing with them somehow, even if you don't. And so one of the skills and strategies that Bravery Angels teaches people is to not fall into that habit of feeling like you can't talk to somebody if you feel disturbed by their ideas or how they're presenting themselves. One of the maxims of Bravery Angels that I really like is, if somebody heard you talking about them, would they feel respected and would they feel understood? And just this idea that how different the engagement is across differences when we can do those two things and still hold space to have our own point of view and to be able to actually have dialogue and debate about things without getting into personal attacks and without falling into all the stereotypes that happen, very naturally and that are so accentuated all around us.
Well, that we're programmed to respond a certain way, it seems
Right.
like, to a lot of like talking points. So somebody will say, like January 6th is a really good example. Like
Right.
you hear the programming on both ends of the political spectrum,
Right.
and it's problematic. Like, and so I guess that's what I'm curious. Is like, they're there, they want to have these conversations.
Right.
Where do they go? Like, how do they start? And
Yeah.
and what are the conversations like? I mean, does it get heated sometimes? Does it
can
get controversial? Do people get like, emotional? And I think that goes without saying they probably do. But
Yeah.
like, what is that like? I guess like, do you have like maybe like some stories? Maybe?
Absolutely. Yeah. One of the main principles for holding space is that you have a moderator or a facilitator of the space, and that you have ground rules, and that goes a long way, so that people can get emotional, can get heated, can share what's personal for them, and not have it go off the rails. And if it does start to go off the rails, to have somebody who can help bring it back into something else.
Sure.
And so that's one of the things that makes this work really effective, to have some containment, because we have so much guiding us and so many tendencies that are reinforced by our culture and by our experiences of it not going that way, that we either hesitate or don't feel confident to step forward into sort of effective engagement, or we just get into something and then it falls apart and becomes a mess, and it's like, I can't talk to you, or I can't talk about this subject, whatever it is. So that's a key, is holding space in a way that empowers people to feel like they can be effective in articulating themselves. And that gets into, so one of the areas that Braver Angels spends time with is skills training and strategy training of how to engage when there's strong differences and strong feelings. And then what you're talking about is sort of topics, like how do you pick a topic like gun control or immigration or abortion or January 6th, something that's controversial. Or Braver Angels did a big push this past year for election integrity, getting people from different sides of that issue after the last election. And so the idea is that when you have ground rules and you have space that's held and you have an understanding that we're not going to do anything until we have diverse representation on this topic, then you've set a foundation for having something effective and productive to happen.
Sure.
And whatever people bring to the table, whether it's strong feelings or strong reactions to each other, or information that people disagree with, so often that's the crux of disagreement right now, is that we have sort of left and right information streams, and sometimes more importantly we have these sort of the mainstream or the alternative information streams, and people just don't share the same sets of common understanding about so many things. And so being able to come and hash that out together and sort of do the clarifying and verifying with each other, where do we actually have differences here? Why do you trust the sources you trust? Where did you get that from? Really trying to get into.
And what are the responses like? What are they? So like I'm definitely, by the way, I want to come. I want to come see this. I want to be a part of this. This sounds really cool. However, I just want to know, like, there must be some really. I mean, I love it when I have people down here all the time hanging out, having creamies and across the political spectrum, right. And then sometimes there's like a little bit of friction, and I'm like, okay, wait a minute, guys.
Right. Yeah. Do we want to go there?
Yeah. Do we really want to go there? I mean, I want to go there, but
right.
What does it get like? I mean, I know what it gets like, but these guys are there to have these conversations.
Right.
So
yeah. So the combination of your self-filtering, so in the sense that somebody who is an extremist, whatever their positions are, and has a position like, I won't talk to people that go beyond that line, or I won't listen to somebody if they're being crazy or using misinformation or being whatever their language is for somebody being beyond the pale. It's like those people aren't showing up to something like this.
Yeah.
And so there's already that filtering that's happened. But then there's the space holding. And so when things get heated, or when there's just some sort of a mess of understanding where it just feels like a knot, and it's like, I don't know what you're talking about, I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah.
Then
that's the worst.
Role of a moderator is to bring things back to, like, okay, we have some sets of common understanding, or some sets of, and sometimes that has to do with, it's like we have values and we have aims, And often we agree on one or both of those, and then it's the behavior or the policies in the middle that we disagree about. So sometimes it's a matter of changing the framing, and it's like, okay, actually, that value that your foundation is, I relate to that, or I agree with that, or I can understand that, and then it becomes really confusing to me, or I'm very troubled by it, whatever it is. And
Sure.
so that's part of the skills training, is empowering people with the skills to disagree in a way that doesn't fall apart. And so much of that is having the experience of seeing that and being guided in that, because it's so against our common experience. So much of the time when we have that experience, it's just like, oh, okay, thank goodness we can have this kind of tricky, complex engagement and not have it go off the rails. And so that's the part that really energizes me and makes me excited to help teach others and hold space for others to be able to do that.
I think that there's just, I mean, it goes out without saying, there's just such a need for the work that you guys are doing right now in this country. And I think people are so hungry for it. We are all desperate to, I mean, I'm not going to say we are all desperate, but a lot of us are really desperate to make connection with each other and figure out, why are they saying the things that they're saying? Where are they getting that from, right? And that I think, like, when it comes from a national perspective and how media is produced, you know, this right here, I'm independent, right? I don't have nefarious backers. I don't have anything, you know, controlling the way that I'm putting out the information. But when we're talking about a national level and even an international perspective in media, there's a lot of behind the scenes going on where even, like, it's somewhat designed to be divisive, like where they're saying, okay, you guys say this on your side of the show, and this is obviously a very silly example, but you guys say this on your side of the show, and we're going to go on our side, and we're going to say this. And I actually think that this is very real. I've heard Tucker Carlson talk about this a little bit. Like, they literally do that, and it's like a real thing. Because it's what sells, and it's what energizes. It's polarizing, and it's how they gotta get views, they gotta get more advertisements, they need more money, they want it. Just that's how the business works. And I found that even for myself, like when I put stuff out, posting stuff, whatever's controversial. And I
what gets attention.
Feel almost guilty about it sometimes.
Right. Yeah. And for me, I find that to be a really interesting opportunity full of possibilities, because for me, as I think about those questions, it's like, yes, there probably is plenty that's sinister there, and then there's all sorts of just understandable reasons why markets and human tendencies push us to do those things. But I also find that in sort of our digital age, where those things are so accentuated and amplified, it's like part of this social tension and this social disintegration that we're all experiencing is a reflection of our tendencies, our human tendencies.
I agree.
To be reactive in that way. And it's an opportunity for us to shift how we relate to our tendencies and our habits about how reactive we are.
Well, and that's just it. Our reactions are now quantified.
Right.
They never were. But now they can measure it, and not only measure it, extrapolate it, and then predict or steer or whatever it might be. And I'm saying this as somebody who's as guilty as really anybody.
Sure.
And I this is the business I'm involved in, but I kind of have a pretty good understanding. I don't know if you're familiar with Shoshana Zuboff, Age of Surveillance Capitalism. It's like
I read that book when it first came out.
Did you really? Okay.
Yeah.
I did not read the whole book, but I was assigned it by Rob Williams
in
his class at the University of Vermont.
Yeah.
And we weren't assigned to read the whole book, but he had specific bits that he wanted us to read.
It was an important book.
It wasn't a very important book. Actually, like even Obama was somebody who promoted that on his reading list. Like everybody should read this.
Right.
And it was very eye-opening, because you then begin to understand how, the human brain is like this kind of like a reactive machine to some degree, and that these social media, not just social media, but media as a whole, has figured out kind of how to hack the responses.
Right.
And I think we're just seeing it get worse and worse in this digital age, because, I mean, think about it. Nobody's watching the news necessarily anymore, but they are getting it on their phones.
Right.
And it's like short clips. It's a lot of the time it's like juiced up with dopamine and like really trying to get those emotional reactions to get you to click a like and share and all that stuff. So it's kind of incredible. So the work that you guys are doing is trying to, at the very least, mend that, I guess, or at least show that this is what's happening.
Right. And it's sort of giving people an opportunity to practice, exercise, and then model for others how to buck those trends and be more sovereign, have different agency about how we show up and how we react to each other.
Sure.
And that's a real key of, on an individual level, it can happen in that way. And when things are made personal, when engagement is made personal rather than being dehumanized through screens or othering each other in all the ways that our politics and our social language does, of lumping each other into big groups and having lots of associated, if you're this, then you're all these other things. And so just really working to have a different relationship to all those tendencies that are there for really good reasons about the nature of how we operate and what we're being confronted with the technologies that our social lives are being so much confronted with.
Yeah, and how we encounter each other too, right? Like I think that what obviously what we're talking about is just like an increasing conversation. There's more and more people are becoming aware of what's being done. I think that a lot of people understand now that the two-party system, to a certain degree, when a lot of people can disagree with me with this, I say this a lot, but they're really two wings of the same bird. And yes, like they're playing us, and that's how they take away our own personal I don't want to say, it's not personal sovereignty, but our own personal ability to take action, I guess. I think there's a word for that, but I can't think of the word right now.
Well, it's disempowering.
It's disempowering, and it's like very distracting, and it's confusing. Once again, like you're saying, like, I don't know where you're getting that information from. I'm confused by what you're saying. It's like I have a perfect example. It's like I had a friend in here on Saturday and another friend. One of them is like Vermont, fairly liberal, just like not politically engaged necessarily, but pays attention to his best time, and and then another friend who was here at the same time, and he was wearing a MAGA hat, right? Which is like, we'll talk about emotional reactions, right? Like people see that hat and they're like, triggered or whatever, and so he's wearing that MAGA hat, and I'm like, I don't really care. I hope he's out there watching right now. I don't care. If you want to wear it here, go ahead. But some of my family, they come over, they're like, who's this guy in the MAGA hat? It's just so funny to me. But anyway, so these two guys, they start kind of having a conversation about the Biden laptop, the Hunter Biden laptop, and then they're talking about the Trump case, and no one's above the law. And then they start just going back, and I felt like I was the moderator, and I'm like, hey, look, everybody, just calm down, all right? Like, we're having a conversation. You want to show a clip to him? Show this clip to him. You want to show this evidence to? Go ahead. But we're not gonna get crazy with it. We just need to, if you guys want to have an honest conversation, I'm here for it. And I love it, by the way. Like I love it personally. Some people can't handle it. I live for it.
Well, and that gets to one of the main principles that Braver Angels is all about, is this idea that rather than our differences canceling each other out or being mutually exclusive or contradictory, that our differences are our strength, and that if we can treat our differences as complements to each other to help shine light on each other's blind spots, help each other develop our thinking and our feeling, it's such a different way of encountering somebody who throws us off. And it's like, if we can have an energy of good faith and curiosity rather than feeling contempt or thrown off or upset or incredulous, so often. And I notice these things in myself all the time. It's like when I have the feeling of, oh my God, here we go, or whatever it is that you just want to step back or write somebody off, and relearning to like step into that. And it's like, okay,
we can do this.
It's good to be uncomfortable, because that's a space that I need to know more about, even if it's a space that I disagree with or I'm troubled about. And this idea that, that's how our social fabric has its strength, not, all the polarization where we withdraw and escalate things is the challenge, that we have to overcome.
No, I've definitely found that having the ability to change, your political views, and that only comes with being able to hear different perspectives. And I think we live in a world of just like cognitive dissonance and just like pure reactions all the time. And I think a lot of the time we could be breathing more. We could take a deep breath and not just give in to our monkey brain. Which I think that's I don't know. You obviously, I mentioned Rob Williams, and this is something that he's always talked about, and he's so right, because we live in a world where we're just inundated with information all the freaking time, and we barely take time to breathe and hold space for ourselves, even, right?
And we're all inundated with different information.
Exactly.
Which is a key.
Yes, that's a very important point. And then all of a sudden, exactly. Somebody comes along who, you're already stressed out, you're already full of anxiety, you're all, honestly, this conversation is refreshing to me right now because I lose sight of it myself, especially somebody who works in media. You're already kind of charged up, and then somebody else comes along, and you're like prepared for that, like you're like ready to tell them off, and it's like, no, man, just take a deep breath, have a conversation with them. You might learn something. You might even learn something about yourself.
Right, and that's one of the tendencies that's so celebrated is this. If you don't convince somebody or win, then what's the point? What was the point of the engagement if you didn't convert them or win and dunk on them somehow? And this idea that that's not how any of us change or grow. Like, no, that's how we withdraw into extremism. That's how we get defensive. That's how we double down. And there's a grace that happens when we engage, seek understanding, take the time to relate to each other, especially when there's strong differences, because we all know from personal experience that when we grow in our feeling or in our thinking or our concepts of something, it's because we have the space to be agitated and have something stir, and it's like, that no longer sits with me the way it used to. It doesn't make sense the way it used to.
Yeah.
But that doesn't happen unless we're given the opportunity. It's like very, very seldom on the spot do any of us change our mind about anything.
It's not easy to.
Right. Like, it's like that's not the natural thing to do. We're going to double down or withdraw.
Yeah. And so, we're all guilty of it too.
And it takes time. And it takes curiosity, and it takes somebody showing up in a spirit of good faith with you, if they disagree with you, to be able to even have that be a possibility. Because otherwise we're just going further and further into our extremist sort of rigidifying and feeling more and more certain about what we feel like we know.
Yeah.
And those are so important to have personal agency about and be able to be open to for ourselves, and then to be able to have relating with other people go that direction. And so that's another piece of this that I find really energizing. You asked for an example earlier.
Yeah.
One of the examples that I really like is early on in my experience with Braver Angels. It was, the height of COVID. It was probably the fall of 2021.
Ooh.
And maybe this was actually the fall of 2020. It was early in COVID. And we all had the experience, whatever our perspectives were. It was like you could try to get into the mess of information, and immediately it was just like, what information are you talking about? That's not my information. And then it would just deteriorate. And so much of it was about framing. And so when we as a group wanted to take on the issue of COVID, what we did, rather than having it be a partisan conversation of red and blue, or whether it was like, do you believe in COVID or do you not believe in COVID, we framed the question for the discussion, and we had sort of a panel discussion, and then the audience all engaged. And the question was, do you feel more concerned about the risks and consequences of COVID, or do you feel more concerned about the risks and consequences of the response to COVID? And just by doing a little bit of a reframe,
wow,
it had everybody thinking a little different. And it was like, for people that just had this reaction of that is crazy or dangerous or foolish or whatever it was, ridiculous, to have a feeling in this other way, it opened this new channel of what would it mean to be concerned about the consequences rather than the urgency of the disease, or for people that were concerned about the consequences of the policies. It was like, okay, I can relate, even if it doesn't make sense to me. I can relate to being concerned about if you feel like this is an urgent, dangerous disease.
Yeah.
Okay, and that gave space for a rich conversation that there was strong disagreement, but it was had in a different way. It like had a very different ground to work up from than if it was like, all right, we've got people who think COVID is a hoax and people who think COVID is a big deal, or whatever framing would be the bombastic way of making it be as polarizing as you could make it. And so that was an example to me of how far just setting the table in a different way for engagement can take us towards having better engagement.
Well, I think that the way that it's framed is such an important way to frame it, because what you have on one end is people that, and take this how anybody wants. You have people that don't actually have to worry about the consequences of the policy decisions, right? Like, they just maybe financially, like, they're fine, like, they don't have to worry about it. And this, by the way, is not blue or red. This is not blue or red. This is, you have people that they're financially, they don't have to worry about it. Maybe they own their home, they don't own a business, and then you have people on the other end who are like, if you close down the economy for another 3 weeks, I'm going to lose my business and possibly my home and possibly, whatever. And that is such an important distinction. And
circumstantially.
Yeah, circumstantially, just like what are the consequences, right? And I to go even further is, it was the same time that this was all going on, that you actually the same exact time. It was like in fall 2020. I had just graduated college, and no, wait a second, it's fall 2021. I just graduated college. I was living in Burlington, and I started to work as an electrician's apprentice at the University of Vermont on like this big project that they were working on. And this was after 4 years or 3 years I transferred. 3 years of being at UVM as a student.
Yeah.
So like I got to see the perspective of the students and how they felt about the construction workers and the tradesmen and the guys that keep everything going.
Right.
And then to see the perspective of the tradesmen and the construction workers and how they felt about the students.
Right.
And it just goes back to what you're saying. It's like, holy cow, if we all realized how important we were to each other.
Right.
And how we're complementary.
Yeah, the value of different points of view. Thank goodness we're all so different in our temperament, in our experience, in our points of view, and that's necessary and valuable.
That comes back to the design of the universe, really. I mean, it's because what we're talking about right now is way, 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 way deeper than just like political.
Absolutely.
It's much deeper than that, because like we were saying, it's nuanced. It's not necessarily a political opinion or a political situation when we're talking about COVID. That might play into it.
Right.
But just as equally, you could have a woman who opened a bakery and she calls herself a liberal, right? And she's very artsy or whatever, and like that type of lady.
Right.
And she's like, I can't be closed for another 3 weeks. And then you have maybe a more conservative tradesman who's in the same boat. Like it doesn't really. It's just these are nuanced situations, and we are all nuanced. I mean, it's kind of incredible. I think that's why the politics and the way that politics, even the word itself, is polarizing.
Right.
Politics.
Right. That you try to find affiliations and groups, and identify across groups and find your in groups. The other thing besides the circumstance is that we have different points of emphasis on our values, and that's one thing that Braver Angels tries to get at, and goes to like Jonathan Haidt's work, if you know his work.
I don't.
But this idea
what's his work?
He's a professor and has written great books about, and now that I'm mentioning his name, I'm not going to remember the books right away, but maybe they'll come to me. But,
that's okay.
But the idea that people who have conservative temperaments or liberal or progressive temperaments often have shared values but different points of emphasis about what their value sets are. And when you overlay that with different experience and different circumstances, if we can relate to each other's values, which, sort of the ground level, our aims or our values on either end of how we behave and how we show up and what our opinions are, that it's so much easier to turn that key of being able to understand and respect somebody that you disagree with, because it's like, okay, I'm just emphasizing a different point of values. So if it's about COVID with our example, it's like somebody who's emphasizing the value of compassion or care versus emphasizing the value of compassion or care for a different group or a different set of values. When you get into coming down to the foundation of where people's feelings and opinions are coming from, you can have a whole different conversation of clarifying what the differences are and being able to find common ground in a new way.
I bet you guys actually have some pretty mind-blowing discoveries together. Like where you might find, like you might be able to pinpoint where, oh, I see where that divide is coming from. Like I see what's being done. And back to your point about like the it's like the different experiences. Like so somebody who's like really caring and compassionate and concerned, somebody who maybe they've had a family member who's passed away because they were sick with something and then they caught the cold and then they died, so then they're, like for my own example, I had family that kept saying to me, Paul, your great grandmother died of the flu, and and it's like, oh, okay, like this is where they're coming from,
what you're emphasizing.
Yeah, it's a really important distinction. And back to that example of working at UVM, being around the construction guys after having been a student for all that time.
Yeah, a quick contrast, and in the same setting. That's such a good, rich environment to learn how different the perspectives can be within the same setting.
Well, there's like this whole other world, right? Like I was going to the gym there, and that's where I was working. It's like we were building a new athletic complex. And so I would go to the gym like as a student, and then I would be there as a construction worker, and I was like, I feel like, and I wasn't allowed to use the bathrooms there, right? And I'm like, I'm using the
The
bathrooms here.
discrimination against the working class,
I'm like, actually, I'm going to be using the bathroom here because I went to this university.
Right.
But anyway, so it was like it was just like to see how much they hated each other.
Right.
But I'm thinking like, man, if everybody had the same attitude as me, you know, I'm sorry, no, but not actually, but if people had the same attitude where it's like, you know, I could try to see where they're coming from both perspectives,
right,
then we could really do amazing things. And I think that's why the power structure at the top or whatever, you know, nationally, right, and the nationalization of politics in all things, by the way,
right,
why they're so driven to do that is to take away from, like we said, your own empowerment. And
right.
it's like
consolidation and centralization.
Yeah, centralization of everything and all things. It's like, doesn't have to be this way.
Right.
And we could actually be so much better off without it. And it just
right.
takes conversations like these, and I'm sure conversations at Braver Angels.
Right. Right. Yeah, and that's a great example of a divide, but like, you know, a representative of a class divide really between working class, blue collar, white collar students and the working class
sure.
around them. And so much of these principles and strategies and skill sets are just as relevant whether it's talking between genders or talking between temperament types.
Absolutely, yeah.
Talking between class, talking economic status, talking between rural and urban political status, whatever it is, you know, being able to approach that friction of the feeling of, I don't relate to these people and I actually, you know, I'm thrown off by these people or feel triggered by these people, whatever it is, it's like, rather than trying to, you know, be like, oh, I want to overcome this feeling towards that group of people. It's like the feeling's coming up for understandable reasons for all of us when we have those feelings. And it's like, how can we relate to that reaction in a new way and transform it into something else?
You just kind of flicked to something in my brain. I don't know if you've, I was actually talking to you before we started about like the Freemasons and their influence in this country. Before, you know, really the founding of it. And I don't know if you've been in the State House. I'm sure you've been in the State House. Yeah. You look at the floors in the State House.
Okay.
It's black and white tiling.
Okay.
And what I've learned, somebody out there maybe can correct me and tell me that I'm wrong, but that is a form of Masonic symbolism, which symbolizes polarity. So it's like black and white.
Right.
And, you know, you think about the yin and yang, right, which is also black and white,
right.
I guess what I'm saying is like it symbolizes the polarity, and when you're talking about like the emotional reactions, it's like that's really more what it's symbolizing than anything, is like what's inside of us and what we're communicating through our emotional reactions,
right.
And I think that there was like a wisdom of this in this country for a long time. And it's been lost, and now we're all just like fighting amongst ourselves. And do you see what I'm getting at? Am I making any sense?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, to me, it's the either or. Like you're talking about this duality, and so often in our politics, especially, it's like right now, so much of my experience of our area in Vermont and the country at large is that there's this idea that too much of a good thing is good, and too much of a bad thing is even worse.
Yeah.
And this idea that there's not the idea that excess in either direction is bad, that both sides of the duality are necessary and good to the degree that they have a role in helping us steer towards balance. And so whether it's conservatism and the value of people being pragmatic, or whether it's progressivism and the value of people being idealistic, it's like there's so much value, but there's this weird skewing of the idea that the more progressive you are, the better you are, and there's no risk or consequence there. And the more conservative you are, it's like the worse you are. Yeah. And this idea that rather than there being extremes and excess on both sides, and it's complicated because there's this idea of centrism or moderation. It's like there's some sort of nuanced difference between homogenizing everything versus having there be an interplay between the tendencies that people show up. You know, it's like we all have our own gifts in our tendencies, in our personalities, and in our talents. And how, again, like that's a good representation of how complementary those differences are. Because thank goodness we aren't all nerdy or athletic. Yeah. Or thank goodness we don't all want to work with our hands or all want to work on a computer. It's like things would fall apart really quickly if everything was uniform in any direction.
See, now this is I'm glad we got to this point, because it does come back to what I was saying about like the structure and the creation. It's like I think a lot of times I get caught up in this, and I know a lot of my friends right now are dealing with this too. It's just straight up. We're all dealing with it to some degree. It's like we look online and we see stuff, and we're like comparing ourselves to others all over the world, literally, endlessly. And females are doing this too. And we get so caught up in it and saying like, man, why don't I own a supercar? You know, like why don't I own a beautiful house, or why don't I have kids yet, or why don't this is me. That's my and I don't want a supercar, by the way. I'd be happy.
Or I want to develop this crazy talent that I saw somebody else.
Yeah, it's like
show.
That's not in the fact that we get to see all that. It's like it's not. That is not within the reins of the human experience so far. Like that is like now we're seeing it, and it's like all we do is we're constantly comparing ourselves to others instead of being thankful for the gifts that we have and recognizing the gifts that we have.
Right.
And instead of competing with others, you just compete with yourself, because ultimately that is what I believe God wants us to do. He doesn't want us comparing ourselves to others, because if he wanted us to be like them, he would have made us like them. He's like, no, you're made perfect the way that you are. And I'm not saying that everybody's perfect the way they are. We all have things that we need to work on and progress.
Right.
But you are born with certain gifts that others are not born with, and you should be thankful for that and use what you were given to make the world a better place.
Right. Yeah. The idea that diversity and contrast are important.
Yeah, and I think does this conversation ever come up at Braver Angels, or do they go there, or is that maybe a little?
Tell me more about what's the there that you're describing.
Well, just like kind of what I'm talking, like the spiritual / religious aspect, where it's like like I had said, like we're all created differently. I mean, we're all created equal, but not. Right? Which is kind of
the complexity that it's a paradox.
It is a paradox.
Rather than a contradiction, it's a paradox.
Yeah. So do they go there? Do they talk about it?
Yeah. A lot of the Braver Angels framework is political and social, but within the activities of Braver Angels, there are specific activities that are designed for communities of faith, and then there's whatever the topic is, that certainly comes up as one of the divides of people of faith in various ways, within and between each other, and then people who are more secular or atheist versus people who have faith. Like that's a huge divide in our communities and in our country.
Yeah, that is a very big divide.
That informs so much of the underlying value sets, what's emphasized, what's on people's radars, how the lens that we see things through, and so that's a great point of contrast that a lot of people feel timid about approaching. It's like, well, I can't relate to somebody who's religious if I'm not religious, or I don't want to get into the territory of talking with somebody that's an atheist or that's secular if I'm a person of faith. And just this idea of, how do you relate when you don't share that sort of foundational set of lenses together?
And how does that go for them, right? Like, let's say you do have a fairly religious person speaking with somebody who's maybe an atheist or Gnostic or whatever it is. How do those conversations come about, and what do they sound like?
Well, the beautiful thing about taking relating down to the personal level is that we all have good reasons for our positions. It's like if somebody's an atheist, they have a reason for being an atheist.
Yeah.
If somebody's a very spiritual or religious person, they have a reason for that.
It goes back to experience.
Or in their whatever their temperament, whatever their experience is. And when we can relate to why somebody is the way that they are, and start there, and be curious and open-minded and in good faith with each other, it's very interesting. It's very interesting to articulate ourselves to each other in space like that, and it's very interesting to hear where other people are coming from, even if we feel troubled or like it's dangerous for some reason, or like it's the person is in error or is operating on bad information, whatever it might be. It's still really interesting on a personal level to go to that sort of foundational level of better understanding. Okay, you must have a good reason for why you are the way you are, why you think the way you do, why you feel the way you do about things. Let's start there, and then that creates a whole grace of engagement that just isn't there otherwise, because we're so often just operating on assumptions. And if you investigate those assumptions and you make things personal, you share from your personal point of view, and you ask for somebody's personal point of view rather than how do you see the whole world? How is, from your perspective, that's so different, and it makes the dialogue really different, or the debate, whatever, the nature of the communication is.
You notice that sometimes when you go into those types of conversations with that, like, that thought of how it's going to go, or like what you think it's going to be like, that a lot of times that you create that environment, you create
Absolutely.
that scenario, whether or not you are creating it or not, but you might give somebody that opportunity then to it's like, how many times do you find yourself like in, maybe this happens to me frequently. I'll be in a conversation with somebody and I'll find myself with an argument with somebody that I am like, they're arguing with me about points that I'm not even making. They're just assuming that that's how I think.
Sure.
There's a phrase for that too, but I don't know what it's called.
Yeah, it's not coming to mind for me, but yeah,
There's a phrase
I
for
recognize
it.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like, how often does that happen, and how much is it my fault? And some of it perhaps is because I'm maybe doing the same thing to them, and I don't know. That's part of my goal with this show too. Like, what we're doing here is to like bring people on that want to have those conversations, and like, I'm not afraid to disagree. Well, I'm not afraid to disagree at all.
And as I've become more familiar with what you guys are doing with this podcast and just with the organization in general, just feeling really grateful that role is being served, and that having a space that's sincere about that as an objective for being able to hold space for disagreement, and this idea that conflict and disagreement can be healthy, it can be toxic. Yes. But if in the absence of conflict and disagreement is way worse than the toxicity of bad conflict and disagreement, because if we avoid all disagreement and conflict, then there's nothing left.
Well, what we're talking about is really in all relationships and in all things.
Absolutely.
Like, I was just thinking about like loved ones, for example. Like, if you have a relationship with maybe a woman that you love, or your husband, whatever, and like, you only argue because you care.
Right.
At the end of the day, like, you might have, and that's most people. I think that there's, in politics, there's probably some sociopaths that don't care, that just like want to take advantage of others. But like, I would say 95% of human beings, they just have, they care. Like, that's why you fight with your wife, right? Or you fight with your dad, or whatever it is. And that's in this is in all things. It's like, human conflict is just it's obviously part of the human experience, and we just have to figure out ways to take those disagreements and grow through them. And I think that's the goal. And I do have one comment I just want to.
Great.
Timothy Page, Guy's son. Guy gets sometimes he's like, oh, Tim's writing in again.
Yeah.
I like it. I like it when you write in, Tim. I think it's great. He writes, you don't need opulence of our forebears, but the simplicity of their forebears. Shocker, God gets it right. I don't know what opulence means, to be honest. Do you know what it means?
I have an impression of what it means, but no, I wouldn't be able to define it either. So, but yeah, Tim, that's an interesting statement. And yeah, I mean, I agree with the sentiment of it.
Yeah, I do too. I know what he's getting at.
Yeah, the complexity is for a reason. There's a good reason why things have a tendency to be such a mess, and it's up to us to make the best of that.
I think opulence means like, you don't need the opulence, meaning like, you don't need permission. Mm-hmm. You don't need the permission or right, I guess, maybe. Right. If you want to let us know, Tim, you can let us know. We would appreciate that. So we have probably, I don't know, maybe 5 minutes more to go.
Well, I would love to go in the direction of what the workshop. You can go to braverangels.org, check it out. You can get in touch with me. I believe the best email address for me is vt-coordinators@braverangels.org. And this workshop that we're doing on the 22nd, it's 9:30 to noon. It's most Braver Angels activities are to hold space for diverse perspectives. We have two exceptions to that. One of them is called blue environment, as you can get in a society that's a pretty blue environment to people that don't feel like they're blue leaning.
Sure.
And the idea of this workshop is to get conservatives, libertarians, people who are disillusioned in whatever way with progressivism, with liberalism, who find themselves in the situation of just swimming against the current all the time. And one of the reasons that Braver Angels has these two workshops in particular is in an acknowledgement of, we often aren't dealing with balance. When we're talking about a topic of information, it's like one person has a minority perspective or a majority perspective, or in our area, to have conservative perspective is often unwelcome. It's often ostracized. It's often demeaned, and so it's hard to for good reason, it's hard to appeal to folks that are conservative leaning to come and engage with progressives because often there's an experience of not feeling respected for your positions, for the way that you emphasize your values. And this is a workshop being read in a blue environment where we're just going to have a group of conservatives get together and talk about some of the communication skill sets is mostly what it's based on. It partly is about networking, having a conversation about what it means to show up as a red in a blue environment, and part of it is to get into some real practical skills and strategies to be more effective at holding ground when we're a minority in the communities that we exist in, whether it's family or work or just the community at large, and it feels like there's just this sense of hostility if you don't go along with whatever the party line is or whatever the majority consensus opinion is.
Sure.
And so that's what the workshop encourage some red-leaning folks in central Vermont and throughout the state to feel like there's value if we're people that lean right, just have the experience, and it becomes reinforced over it is so much the predominant stream in our area and much of Vermont, but especially around an area like Montpelier or Burlington.
I think there's actually a lot of progressives in the state that realize the new perspective is needed.
Right.
Not to get political with it, but we see things coming out of Burlington all the time where people, like just one recent example, we actually broke the story. The mayor is getting free meals, right? And like I've heard from a lot of Burlingtonians who are relatively, maybe liberal or far leaning to the left, that even they're like, well, wait, what? Like, you're not supposed to be doing that. And so I guess like Vermont is just so far one way that even when you take some of us over here on the right, it's like I just have like, if I were to go to Florida, I'd be normal, what I mean? or wherever, and not even normal. I'd just be like in the middle. I'd probably be moderate,
Right.
But here I'm like, oh, far right extremists. It's like we do have a responsibility to like kind of just bring it back a little bit to reality here, folks. And I say that maybe I shouldn't say reality, but
this idea of balancing out excess, that
exactly
to really be able to help people recognize that there is such a thing as too much of a good thing, and if to you progressivism or liberalism is a good thing, to recognize that having some moderation, having some diversity of perspective is really important. And when we live in a state with a supermajority, that's even more relevant.
What you're talking about, moderation, like politically, but too much of a good thing, right? So like alcohol or drugs or whatever you're into, sex, whatever you're into, they're always like, their beliefs were like moderation.
Right. The role of discipline and balance and limits and boundaries, all those things that our culture likes to say, things will be better if we don't have any of those things.
Absolutely. No, it's so incredible.
Yeah.
I just have a little bit of a response here from Timothy.
Yeah, thanks.
Let's see. I just don't want to. Decadence, overabundance, hedonistic. I think that's what opulence means.
Hedonistic?
Hedonistic, yeah.
Okay.
I always. Yeah. And he says, stay tuned for an article soon on the response to Mulvaney standing. Is there anything else you want to add before we get going?
Well, it's been a pleasure to talk with you.
Yes.
And for anybody that's watching or listening, just encourage you to check out braverangels.org. And if politics isn't your thing, I just, for myself as a state coordinator, politics isn't my thing. I don't think through the lens of sort of political affiliation and partisanship, but I get the value of framing it in that polarizing way, so that you have an anchor to have representation around. And so if you find that you're purple and not blue or red, or whether you find yourself like I just don't want to deal with that language, that I think that these skills and strategies and holding space and having the experience of practicing these things is just as relevant, and that you can use it in your life in all sorts of ways, even if politics isn't your thing. And so I just encourage anybody who finds that interesting to come and check out this session on the 22nd at the Legion in Montpelier. And if you're a person who finds yourself not being a blue leaning person, whatever that means, if you're heavily red leaning, or if you're just questioning, wait, maybe this blue culture in excess is too much for me. I don't feel like I have a home of being a minority in a blue area.
Okay. Well, I just want to throw it out there. There's a good chance that I'll be there. I just want to thank everybody that's out there who tuned in, and participated. Timothy, always appreciate the comments. And thank you so much, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. This has been a Creemee Cast live from Bean Studios in Northfield, Vermont.